Welcome to the stage our final speaker, David Schwartz. David, if you'll come up. He serves as the head of global policy for Cigna, and he will talk to us about a very timely topic, particularly since we were just finishing up the presidential election. David, would you want the lavalier?
No.
Okay.
So good morning. You know, I always appreciate the opportunity to get out of Washington, see what is happening in the real world. And when PBGH asked if someone would come and talk about what was going to happen, you know, in the next Congress and in the next administration, I thought, well, that shouldn't be too hard, right? Because I, like everybody else, was sort of expecting that Secretary Clinton was going to win. All of the pollsters were predicting that Democrats were going to retake the majority in the Senate. And for purposes of health policy, that meant largely sort of the status quo, maybe a few tweaks here and there, but certainly moving in the same direction. And then, so I committed, bought a ticket, came here, put some slides, to come here, put some slides together as an outline. And then 4 weeks ago, we had an election. In my office, I had actually been predicting that Donald Trump might win and that we should not take for granted that sort of the establishment would usher Secretary Clinton to victory. So turns out I was right about that. And you heard earlier that there are a lot of reasons people offer for that, but it's not what I'm here to talk about. What I am here to talk about is what is it now that's going to potentially happen. And the results of this election are really very different. I've lived in Washington long enough to see several transitions from Democrats to Republicans, Congresses where balance of power has shifted or not. This feels very different. This is, I would say, sort of the transition where there's the least known about the incoming administration, and not just Mr. Trump. And Vice President-elect Pence is a little bit better known, having spent time obviously serving in Congress. But it's also all the folks that they're relying on for advice now as part of the transition team. You all undoubtedly have seen the same press reports that I have about cabinet picks and other picks that the president and the vice president-elect are making. Some of those are names that we may recognize inside Washington. Obviously, there are a few, particularly obviously given the focus on healthcare. Congressman Price as the pick for Secretary of HHS. So he's been in Washington a long time. He's certainly a little bit better known. But then you've heard mention of CMS today. Obviously, that's where a lot of action for the issues that we're going to talk about takes place. And the woman who has been picked to run that agency is a complete unknown in Washington. So that's a long way of saying I don't have answers to all of your questions. I'm going to say I'm not sure a number of times, but I think that you're all still here and not headed out the door for lunch because you have questions. So I'm going to try to go through my slides quickly. There's not a whole lot in there, and they're a lot less exciting. The other slides had videos, and they were interactive. Mine are pretty boring, so I don't think you'll be upset if we try to move through quickly. I do really want your questions. There were a few that were pre-submitted, and I'll try to incorporate them as we go. But this presentation is really more about you, so some of the burden will actually fall to you. Okay, so the federal balance of power. We have what is called a unified government for the first time in a while. The president or the administration is under Republican control, and obviously so are both chambers in Congress. What that really means is we anticipate now, right, repeal and replace, which has been a Republican sort of mantra since the Affordable Care Act became law back in 2010. We think this is it. We think now the Republicans have all their ducks in a row, so to speak. They can pass a repeal law in Congress, and they will have a president effective January 20th, who wants to sign it. What the replace means is a little less clear, but we'll talk about that. One little deviation I just want to point out is sort of what the election results in the states were. I'm not going to go state by state, but the visual here I think is important. Just look at the colors. So the blue represents a state where the state house and the governor's mansion are under Democratic control. So that would be a unified state government. Everything that's not blue is either shared or it's red, in which case it's a unified Republican state government. Republicans picked up a number of state houses, and I forget the exact number. Why is this important? Contrary to sort of, I think, what the last speaker said, I actually do think most of healthcare is local. I do obviously work for an insurance company, so we are regulated at the state level and at the federal level, so we pay a lot of attention to what state legislatures look like, who's in the governor's mansion. But one other sort of anecdotal thing that this map always makes me want to talk about is one of the things that the president-elect said that he was going to do early on, and I haven't heard him talk about it, I think, since he won. But while he was campaigning, he said he was going to try and enact a term limits constitutional amendment. Term limits make people in Washington very nervous because term limits means unemployment. A constitutional amendment, in case anyone has forgotten, has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Republicans control just under 3/4. I think they're 2 state houses shy of control of 3/4 of the states. So it'll be really fascinating to see, if that really happens. Obviously, constitutional amendments don't happen very often in our country's history, and so if this is time for one, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. For healthcare purposes, the other sort of important takeaway from this slide is you have a number of red states that actually are Medicaid expansion states, and how that affects markets remains unclear if the Medicaid expansion is to be repealed as part of the repeal of the ACA or Obamacare. So every president-elect gets an official transition team and a transition office, and it's taxpayer funded, and it's all publicly available, and there's some level of transparency there. And of course, in the recent past, they all also got a website. So this comes from the president-elect's website. I do not want to walk through all of these bullets with you. You can access this list if you want to see it. I'm not going to leave this slide up too much longer, but the real value here is look at the variety of issues that the transition team put forward, and you can see this was literally the Thursday after Election Day of Tuesday, so they clearly had it sort of ready to go. And this is also the order in which it appeared on the website. So repeal and replace, obviously we've heard him say that, we know it's a top priority, but as you scan through, there are a number of really complex, complicated, and significant issues on here, not the least of which is the next to last bullet, modernize Medicare. Modernize is a word for those of you who haven't spent a lot of time in the Beltway. It's a word that politicians like to use to cover all manner of sin. It also is a great word to use when you're not sure what you want to do from a policy perspective. Modernizing Medicare is something I predict you will start to hear a lot more about, and it is not because it's really one of the president-elect's top priorities, but it is because it is a top priority for the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and others in Congress. But in particular, Paul Ryan has had designs on making changes to Medicare for a number of years. That topic's already getting a lot of sort of buzz in Washington, and will there be Medicare changes, won't there be Medicare changes? So I think it's interesting that it's on this list, and sort of stay tuned for more to come on the Medicare front. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the ACA. First thing, no president of any party can ever repeal any law. That's not how the Constitution works. It's not how our government works. So one thing I will say for certain is on January 20th, after the oath of office, Donald Trump will not be able to repeal the law. It wasn't true 4 years ago when it was Mitt Romney's campaign promise that on his first day in office, he would repeal Obamacare. 4 years later, we heard the same thing. It's actually not possible. So what is possible? Why did I come all the way here to tell you what can't happen? Well, so what is possible is there's a broad range of what's possible. If we look at, members of Congress are not particularly creative or inventive, so we often look to what has already happened to project what will happen next. So about this time last year, the House and Senate were under Republican control, and they passed a repeal bill. The House had already engaged in somewhere around 4 dozen votes to repeal the ACA over the sort of 4 or 5 year period preceding it. But the reason last year's vote was important was because it was the first time the Senate, under Republican control, was going to be able to vote to repeal. So there was a bill that did a couple things. The employer mandate technically still remained in law, but the penalties were zeroed out. So failure to comply had no effect. The individual mandate, same thing. The penalty was zeroed out, so individuals who didn't have coverage would not be required to pay, when they filed their taxes, would not be required to pay a penalty. The net effect, obviously, is that the behavior also changes when there's no penalty. The advanced premium tax credits, or subsidies as they're known, and the cost sharing reduction that's available to individuals who purchase individual or family plans on the exchanges were also repealed, but only after a 2-year, what some people call delay, some people call it transition. So again, this was all happening at the end of 15. They repealed those effective 12/31/17. So 1/1/18 would have been sort of a new world order under a Republican replace plan, which we did not see. The Medicaid expansion was similarly repealed after 2 years, and then a whole bunch of the revenue provisions. So there is a tax on the folks in my industry, the health insurer fee, that was repealed. The much maligned Cadillac tax was also repealed. So a couple of those things. But it was a short bill. For those of you who really want to look at it, it's HR 3762. You can find it on congress.gov. It's about 8 or 9 pages. It offers no clue as to what the replace plan would have been. And it therefore, I think, raises more questions than it answers. So one of the questions that was pre-submitted relates to employer reporting. And do I think that will go away, and what will happen with those requirements? So I just said the employer mandate penalty was zeroed out, but the mandate itself was still on the books. Well, the reporting requirement was still on the books too under that repeal bill. So if Republicans do exactly the same thing, but this time they'll have a different outcome because last year's bill was vetoed by President Obama, we obviously anticipate if they did that bill again in January, it would be signed into law by President Trump. So technically the reporting requirements would still be in effect. Part of the reason this is also complicated is the process. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about what is sort of a complicated congressional process, but if you've read any of the press coverage about sort of what people anticipate will happen, or even if you look at my slide, you can see the word reconciliation. Reconciliation is sort of an arcane process that really only applies in the Senate. So in the House, the majority always controls. There are very, very few things that ever require more than a simple 51% vote in the House of Representatives. So it's very much a majority rules body. In the Senate, most things are subject still to a filibuster. And in order to get around a filibuster, you need a supermajority of 60 votes. So Republicans will have 52 votes in January when the new Congress starts. So they're 8 shy, which means that the minority, the Democrats, have some leverage, have some ability to either prevent a bill from moving or to try and use an amendment process if there's one available on an individual bill. And the Senate really is sort of created on the theory that minority rights, the rights of the minority party, are very important. And the Senate is sort of built to foster a more bipartisan approach and a compromise approach, except for reconciliation. Reconciliation is a way to make the Senate look like the House. Reconciliation is what's called a privileged vehicle, certain time limits and expedited sort of consideration, but most importantly, 51 votes. 51 votes and you're out the door of the Senate and the bill's on the way to the president. So why is that important? Well, because I just told you the Senate Republicans will have 52 votes. That leaves them a margin of error of 1. Interestingly enough, 1 of the 52 is Susan Collins, the senator from Maine. She voted no last year on that repeal bill that I mentioned, HR 3762. She has been hounded by the press since November 8th, asking, what is she going to do this time? She has, in typical politician fashion, not answered the question. But I was never very good at math. It's sort of why I chose a policy career. But even I can subtract 1 from 52 and realize that's it. So they need to keep their caucus together, which is important because it means that the House needs to be a little bit more moderate than it might otherwise be so that everyone in the Senate can vote for this and it can go to the president. It is possible, just a word about timing, it is possible that this process will start as early as January 3rd. That is when Congress comes back in. The 3rd itself isn't really much of a workday. It's swearing in and a lot of ceremonial photographs and some parties. But they can get to work as early as the 3rd of January. I keep being asked, will Donald Trump take the oath of office, walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, walk into the Oval Office and sign a repeal bill? That seems highly unlikely based on conversations with Republican Hill staffers. They don't think they can move quite that quickly. But I do think that we will see some action early on. I should point out there's tremendous strife within the Republican sort of membership in Congress, but also the sort of intellectual Republican establishment in Washington. There are more conservative folks who say that 3762 doesn't go nearly far enough and you should do more. There are others who say, be very careful, we're now playing with live ammunition, and if we start to do things like repeal a mandate or take away subsidies, we're going to start to own the disruption in the market, which is not something that's been true before. The sort of you break it, you bought it theory to health policy. I don't know if that's entirely true, but clearly the political debate has been very much Republicans blaming Democrats. On January 20th, they're not going to have that ability really anymore. So I wish that all of this uncertainty wasn't the case because, well, A, it would make my presentation here much easier and probably much shorter. But it also, in the real world, right, for all of you, for employers all across the country, for individuals who either have coverage under Obamacare or even who don't, but who have other coverage, and to the extent that, on some level, when you squeeze on this side of the balloon, it shoots out over here. So from an insurer's perspective, this uncertainty is not good for us in any of our lines of business. One final note that's at the bottom of the slide, obviously, unless and until something is repealed, compliance is required. The other thing that means for an insurer who's participating in exchanges is we are prepared to continue to offer the plans that we said we would offer before Election Day for all of 2017. One question I've gotten a number of times is, am I gonna lose my plan on January 20th or fill in the date that a repeal bill is signed? And I will say, even though I don't think Republicans are anywhere near consensus, I do think almost all of them realize this is not turnkey. You cannot rip coverage away from people. There needs to be a transition. Like I said, their bill from last year really had a 2-year period. There are some people who are saying that might not even be enough. So there's a lot that we don't know, but I do think the sort of sky is falling tomorrow is not a real worry, because I think that there's just a general understanding that things didn't start that quickly under the ACA, and you can't really sort of turn them off that quickly either. I put this slide in here too, just to show you that the president-elect has a large number of priorities. So some of these will compete, or a number of these will compete with a repeal and replace Obamacare priority for his attention, for the attention of his cabinet. There's a lot to do, right? This is a big country. There's a lot of business to engage in. And, it's not entirely clear how many of these are first 100 days. Certainly repeal and replace is something that we know will get attention in the first 100 days. But a number of the other ones you will recognize as having been very sort of passionate causes for Mr. Trump when he was a candidate. So we would anticipate that those would rise to the level of action in the first 100 days as well. And again, this is directly from, this was actually from his campaign. He had submitted a contract with the American voter. I'm not sure how many of you saw that, but it was an actual written document, and that's where this list comes from. And so these are priorities he has identified for himself. But again, it's just sort of more context. Okay, so we put together sort of a top 5 list for employers from a health perspective mostly. The first one is actually interesting. It was mentioned on one of the previous slides and I didn't point it out, but one of the things that members of Congress have said that they would like to do, and also as a candidate, Mr. Trump said he would like to do, and that is reform the tax code. So our tax code's about 30 years old, right? We have sort of an international, a corporate, and an individual, and sort of nobody likes any of them. There have been a lot of attempts to do tax reform actually in the last 8 years, including an effort where President Obama put forth some ideas, a number of members of Congress put forth some ideas, but after the whole experience of the ACA, there was sort of an agreement amongst the Republicans that they would not work with President Obama on comprehensive tax reform. So there's some pent-up demand. I think it is widely anticipated that a stab at tax reform will be taken in 2017. I don't know if it will cover all 3, international, corporate, and individual. There's now some debate that maybe they would just focus on corporate, although it's hard to separate that entirely from individual. But one piece that I do want to flag is the exclusion from an employee's income of the value of their employer-sponsored coverage, right? So forever, employees have had no tax liability for the coverage that their employers provide them. And when the drafters of the ACA sat down at the table, they kind of thought, well, maybe it's time to change that. There's all sorts of reasons that I won't get into why that might have made policy sense or economic sense. But the overwhelming political reaction was, don't touch the exclusion. So instead, they came up with what's called the Cadillac tax, or officially the 40% excise tax on high-value employer-sponsored coverage. So I think we all probably know that the Cadillac tax is not super clearly written. The guidance that's come out of Treasury is even more confusing. All of this led to a great deal of consternation, and ultimately Congress was persuaded to implement a 2-year delay. So we're now looking at a 1/1 of 2020 effective date for the Cadillac tax, but I think everyone, certainly Cigna, is hoping that it will be repealed, because we think a lot of it is actually beyond salvation, and it creates the wrong incentives for employers who provide coverage. Well, Republicans were supportive of that delay. They're as opposed to the Cadillac tax on policy reasons as Democrats have now become. But they see the connection back to just, well, what do we do in the employer-provided space? And, oh, look, that exclusion is still there. Democrats didn't touch it. It cost this country a fair amount of revenue. It's one of the biggest sort of tax loopholes, as some people call it. So there has been discussion about imposing a cap on it. It's not clear what that cap would be, how it would work, what would be subject to the cap, what might be outside the cap. But this is definitely an area to watch, and I think, tax reform, as a health person, right, I already told you I don't like math, I like tax even less. But we have to make sure that they're not sort of implementing what is a significant health policy in the tax code, right? That's how it already works. We want to make sure if they're going to make a change, they understand how the application of that change would affect the employer-provided market, right? Which is now where just over half the country gets its coverage. It's actually the most stable market we have. It was largely unaffected by the Affordable Care Act. The employers obviously were affected, but that market generally is still working the way that it was, and the sort of thought that a lot of employers would drop never really materialized. So we are watching. We encourage all of you to watch. We encourage you to talk to employers, to folks in their HR departments about how benefits are structured and what a cap might mean to them, and to just generally sort of be aware. Real quickly on the other four, ERISA is always something that we need to make sure is safe and not sort of caught up in a battle over health policy. And should we restore? You're going to hear about restoring the role of regulator to the states. I worked for an insurance company. States never lost that role, but that's a Republican talking point, and there's certainly, it makes sense on some issues to defer to states. But we read that a little bit as, are you chipping away at ERISA, right? And the whole value is, if you are an employer that operates in more than one state, the protection that ERISA offers you is what allows you to continue that and make it viable and, quite frankly, relatively easy to put a plan together. Wellness programs became surprisingly political in the last, I would say, 12 months. And from an odd place. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, issued 2 rules related to wellness programs. The good news is they are universally disliked by Democrats and Republicans in Congress. We do anticipate that those rules will somehow be legislated either over or around. Wellness programs are something that employers do very well. The sort of restrictions that are in these rules we think are ill-conceived, if you will. So look for more activity in the wellness space. Similarly, there's a non-discrimination rule that comes out of the ACA. It's section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, and it says basically you can't discriminate in any way that you already couldn't discriminate under existing civil rights statutes. But it also puts a new twist on potential liability for an employer, particularly one who is self-insured, and again, sort of circles that back to the EEOC. It also has a focus, an expanded focus, I would say, on sort of what gender discrimination means, particularly as relates to the transgender community. I suspect that some of that may be reshaped in a Trump administration, but again, something for everyone to keep an eye on. And then the last one, we've already sort of talked about, what is the future of the individual market? Well, we don't really know yet, but to the extent that the individual market is more or less attractive to the consumer, that will put demand on employers to either continue offering, to the extent folks don't like the individual market, Or it may, if the next answer, if the sort of new world order, as I call it, under Republicans is significantly better, then maybe folks will want to go and buy their coverage there, and it will ultimately alleviate employers from having to offer it. That is obviously a huge question. The answer to that is not only not knowable today, but I suspect not knowable for months and maybe even years to come. But so those are our big five. One sort of shameless plug for our website, informedonreform.com, is something, and I'm not responsible for it, so maybe it's not so shameless, but this is a place where we provide information to everybody about what is happening in the world of healthcare reform. Make a note, check this website. Obviously, you have other resources, but Cigna is more than happy to be a resource for you as well. So I didn't look at my watch, but hopefully we still have at least 10 or 15 minutes for questions. And while you're all thinking, I'm going to ask, there were two questions that were pre-submitted that I've tried not to talk about at all, which relate to drug pricing and drug spend. You heard from the previous speakers a little bit about sort of behavior that the drug manufacturers engage in and how it affects spending. There's a huge amount of pressure on Congress to do something. This is a huge populist issue, so they want to appear responsive. I think the hard part is that they don't really know exactly what to do. Do I think that we'll see some legislative attempt at something? I do. I can't tell you right now what I think that will be. And I will point out that I think the pharmaceutical industry has a long and sort of pretty successful record of working with administrations, with members of Congress to try and minimize the impact on its business of any legislative proposals. So that's going to be a real fight. I wish that I had a better answer on that. Obviously, working for an insurance company, we have very significant concerns about drug spend as well. I do think that in the long run, what you'll start to see is more similar to sort of how we treat the medical benefit, which is this movement towards high value, high quality, instead of sort of just paying a la carte for everything. But let's open it up.
What are your thoughts, especially from an insurance provider point of view, on the possibility of the president-elect opening up the state boundaries for purchasing of health care from other states? And what effect would that have on a market like Western PA, which is an oligopoly of vertically integrated providers? And would it be available to companies like us to buy into for employer health care? So it's a loaded question, I'm sorry. But
No, it's a great question. It's all about selling across state lines. So, during the Affordable Care Act, the Democrats asked the insurers how they felt about this. This is not a new idea. This has been kicking around for a long time. And the insurance industry said, we don't want that. It's not a solution to a problem in the mind of the insurance industry, or at least it wasn't years ago, and I've heard nothing to indicate that that's changed. I said earlier that we're regulated by states. That is how insurance works. Even after the Affordable Care Act, the primary regulator is still the state. So we also have apparently a disagreement. Previous speaker said healthcare is not local. I already said it is local. I'm going to say it again. Healthcare is absolutely local. When Cigna puts a product out into the market, it offers you a network of providers that are there. If you were in this market and you could buy a product, say that Cigna had submitted in pick a state, New Mexico, we're not going to have Pittsburgh providers in our New Mexico product. We're also going to follow the New Mexico rules for what coverage has to look like. And so state mandated benefits are a big deal. Most of those state mandated benefits are the result of state legislative action. So theoretically, they represent the needs of the people in that state. One of the best examples is autism, right? There's actually huge variation around coverage of autism and related disorders around the country because it all depends on what states have required. So I think a lot of times the insurance industry says, well, does it become a race to the bottom? Do we all go to the state with the fewest mandates and the smallest number of providers? And is that where we sort of get licensed and then everyone from all across the country buys that? But then what is that coverage worth to them, 2,000 miles away? I would also point out that in the Affordable Care Act, there is some flexibility for states to enter into a compact to allow for the sale of insurance amongst those states that make that agreement. No states have chosen to do that. Insurance commissioners do not really like this sale across state lines. And to be totally candid, we've heard from some Republican staffers that this is part of the Republican package. So it's usually sale across state lines, some medical malpractice reform, a couple other sort of perpetual or annual ideas, I guess they really are. They will be part of a package, but they're not intended to really solve a problem. So it's a little hard to answer exactly how it could work, because I think right now the common wisdom is that it will never come to be. Okay, other questions? Some of you must have questions. Everyone just wants lunch, which I can respect. Okay, thank you.
We all run out of here. Thank you, David, for such a timely presentation. I don't know where we are, I forget it. So I just would like to thank all of our speakers again. We appreciate Cigna for their partnership. Thank you for supplying such a dynamic speaker and knowledgeable speaker. David, I would assume you answered most of the questions in your very comprehensive presentation. So your evaluations are already in your inbox, so please conduct and complete your evaluations. I'd also like to remind everyone that the importance of employee education. We're really excited about our new relationship with EdLogix, and please encourage your members to participate in the demo throughout December. I look forward and visit their table. Look forward to additional opportunities to learn about EdLogix throughout 2017. For the advisory group who have a lunch meeting, you're in City Center A. That's the meeting where the lunch is being held right now. And then please join us in 2017. The first kickoff of the first forum will be on February 16th. That's the PBGH Trends Forum. For those of you who have speaker ideas or topics, please, we're taking those now. We have one slot filled. We have 1 to 2 slots left that we could fill for that forum. So please let us know if you have speaker recommendations. The next meeting is the 15th Annual Healthcare Executive Leadership Forum, where we'll have health plan leadership and provider leadership representation. That's on March 14th. And then, of course, we have our September 7th symposium. So lots in between that, but thank you, Happy New Year, and thank you for your attention.